We've used Ag Leader on our farm for a long time. They just keep getting better. From brand to brand, cab to cab, Ag Leader offers a complete package for your year-round precision farming.
Oh, I see.
Let them help you plant it, apply it, harvest it, steer it, and manage it more efficiently and profitably.
That straight cash rent might be a really good situation. However, more than likely, you're going to see more and more people move towards the variable rent scenarios in order to benefit everybody. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the higher level of management, the complexities that go into this, it's more, but landowners are going to continue to expect more out of us as farmers. We should expect that and plan for that and be prepared with the information, because if you're not, as a tenant, someone is going to be.
Right.
There's going to be someone else out there that's going to rent that farm.
Ladies and gentlemen, farmers, ranchers, and distinguished guests, thank you for listening to the Farm for Profit Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas, methods, trends, and techniques available to help your farm achieve higher levels of farm profitability. The Farm for Profit Podcast is co-hosted by Tanner Winterhoff, the Iowa Bankerman, and David Whitaker, the Iowa Land Guy, where in tandem they will share their ideas and advice from industry experts. Thank you again for listening to the Farm for Profit Podcast. Remember, if you aren't farming for profit, you won't be farming for long. And now, here's Tanner and David.
And listeners, welcome back to the Farm for Profit Podcast. This is Tanner Winterhoff.
This is Corey Hillebo.
Do you think they ever get tired of us introducing ourselves that way?
Probably.
Or is it still helpful to new listeners?
Maybe I should just introduce myself. I'm at Corn, Pork, and Beans.
And I'm at Iowa Bankerman.
Yeah.
That's how you can follow us on most social media platforms. But thanks, more importantly, for joining us. And if somebody told you about our podcast, please thank them for us. We appreciate them sharing it with you. If you've got any suggestions for topics as you go along and through this, send us an email, farm4profitllc@gmail.com. We take any and all suggestions into consideration, just like the topic we're going to cover today.
And as always, we have a listener review. You can send listener reviews from that same email, or you can call or text us and leave us a voicemail, 515-207-9640. Today's listener review is brought to you by Gearinghoff, head of the class and out of the crop. Check them out, guys. They're great harvesting heads.
Absolutely. And this comes from an area code 806, a longtime friend of the podcast, and I think the most reviewer listener. Like, we've had reviews on all platforms possible. So is this like a super fan?
Super reviewer.
Super reviewer says, "Hey guys, Austin Bolin here. Love the podcast. Very informative and good for a good laugh. Keep up the great work."
Thank you, Austin.
So Austin snuck in a twofer on us because we doubled up early on in our podcast review history. And then he went to Apple Podcasts, and then he went to our social media platforms. So this man is hitting us on all fronts.
So he's our first double review.
Triple. He's triple. We've already done him twice.
Wow.
So hey, listeners, it catches our attention. We know who you are.
No, give us a call. Shoot us a text, 515-207-9640. We love getting them.
Absolutely. And now this topic today has been requested by a lot of people. As we dive into this, you'll recognize that we get behind the issue and to the bottom of the issue. We know that everybody is intrigued about growing and sustaining their farm, at least size-wise, especially in the row crop side of things.
Yeah.
So we're going to cover the lease options available, the way that you can get access to farmland with a great friend of ours, Shay Foulk. So let's dive right into that conversation.
Daddy, did you know 1 out of 10 people in North America works in the agricultural industry?
You're right, Gabby. With the global population expected to increase to 10 billion by 2050, the demand for sustainable food sources will become even more important than ever before. The agricultural industry employs people in a wide range of professions, including accountants, engineers, farmhands, IT specialists, technicians, salespeople, truck drivers, even podcast hosts, and much, much more.
Daddy, your listeners' next career can help put food on the table for people around the globe.
You're right, Gabby. If they go to agcareers.com, that will connect job seekers with employers in the agricultural industry with more than 4,000 jobs posted every month. agcareers.com, that is agcareers.com, can help you find your next career. Set up your free job seeker account and apply for jobs today. Or if you're looking for employees, get started today by posting your first job for only $150 when you use the code Farm4Profit to save. That is Farm, the number 4 Profit. Your next opportunity awaits at agcareers.com. All right, Corey, a topic that is, again, much requested by our listener base. Of course, there's probably underlying reasons behind the request, but Corey, a lot of people are curious about alternative ways to gain access to land, farm ground in particular, outside of just paying a straight cash rent dollar figure.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to skin this cat.
Well, we're going to try and lay them all out here. So we have the extreme privilege of having Shay Foulk here in this episode with us. He grew up on a farm in northeast Iowa. He works on a row crop farm and livestock operation with his father, uncles, and grandfathers. He attended Iowa State University, near and dear to our hearts, and majored in agronomy. After graduating, he enlisted in the United States Army, served with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He now farms and runs Monier Seed with his father-in-law near Sparland, Illinois. Welcome, Shay.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Good to be here.
Did I say that correct? Monier
Seed. We are in Sparland, Illinois, northwest Illinois, for those of you who are not familiar.
And we've had Shay on the show before, so welcome back. Thanks again for not letting us run you off.
Yeah.
Not yet.
But let's dive right into it. We got a little bit of your background. Why don't you catch us up since the last time we talked? What do you got going on out there in Illinois?
I tell you what, crops look really good right now in our area. We had a great planting window. Corn is really starting to hit its stride with the 90-degree temperatures that we've had here. Haven't had as much of the wind. Soybeans could use a little bit of rain as well, but I think straight out of the gate here, we're looking pretty good, and we'll just see how the summer progresses. Seed business stuff's going well. Got a little 6-month-old in the family, so we got lots happening.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah, the stuff I've seen on social media this spring, Illinois is doing much better than we are here in Iowa for planting progress and getting along, but we'll see if we can catch up.
Yeah.
The consultant that I work with there in Iowa, Chris Barron, he made the comment the other day. I think most of Iowa is probably 10 to 12 days behind as far as maturity goes from where most of Illinois is, and just how we caught those rains. But we've seen it time and time again. Everybody thought last year Iowa was going to have a disaster with the drought and pulled record yields. So Every year's a gift.
Yep. All right. So now on to the topic at hand. So we all know that one of the ways to fully control access to land is to own it. But that's not what we're here to talk about today, because we know we can go out and we can buy it. We know the steps that we have to take to get through that. But the alternative way to gain access to land, especially in row crop farming, is to lease it in one form or fashion. So what does that look like on a basic level, Shay?
So the basic level of these rental agreements, lease agreements, however you want to call it, is just the cash rent that everybody's familiar with. And there's pros and cons to it. The first thing that I think I would point out on that is it is a 100% risk assumption for the tenant in that scenario. It's a variable input cost. The landowner doesn't have to worry about it, just as long as the check and or checks come in when they're supposed to be. There's variations, though. Some operations will rent a piece on cash rent for only tillable acres. Some of them will take the whole tract, as well as any, CRP, waterway, grass management scenarios that go with that. So there is variation, and it's important to keep that in mind if you're looking to add acres to your operation or maybe working with a new landowner. What are their expectations? Do they want you to manage that whole property? How involved do they want to be in a cash rent scenario, and how do you help them achieve their goals with that cash rent?
And so the reason that we're having this conversation is because we've been reached out to from so many listeners about cash rent or leasing. Tanner told me before we started that that's why they want, but me as a farmer, I'm like, they just want to know how to get more land. So we're going to go through the different types of leases that we can do, but ultimately I want to figure out as a farmer, what are some good strategies to get more land?
Yeah, what's going to be a good fit for you?
Because as a young farmer, you talked about buying land. Land has doubled in price, it seems like, and good thing Dave's not in the room because he'd say how awesome it is. But it's extremely hard. It never cash flows, but it is extremely hard right now. $20,000 an acre, it seems like, here in Iowa.
Yeah, land is an expensive resource. I mean, that's the reason we lease versus own, because it's a large capital investment on the operator side of things to try and own the land. So as you accurately described, Shay, it is a variable expense to the tenant, to the operator, when you just go at a straight cash rent, established dollar figure by the acre, whether it's gross or tillable. That's the agreement. So many individuals will do this. And would you say, is this the most common lease agreement out there?
I'd say it's regional. But yes, overall in the Corn Belt, between straight cash rent and then what we're going to talk about here in a little while of different share rent options, definitely one of the most common. And, I think one of the reasons you probably have so many listeners reaching out to you is farmers like to have control. Okay. And so when it comes to the cash rent, and not only the land prices doubling, as you mentioned, but the increase in cash rent that we've seen over the last 2 decades, we have periods of higher productivity, higher crop prices, that rent comes up and then prices drop and that rent doesn't go anywhere. It plateaus, maybe comes back down a little bit, but ultimately we've seen this dramatic increase in both land prices and the associated rent. And so as farmers, we need to find creative solutions that benefits everybody on how do we improve this situation? How do we make it more fair? What other options are out there? The one thing I'll say, though, when it comes to cash rent is few things are as consistent year over year if you can lock in a long-term lease on cash rent. So that's maybe one of the advantages, one of the pros that you have with a cash rent. You have a tenant, you have a landowner that wants to work with a tenant for a long period of time. Sure, that cash rent might seem a little bit high for what it is right now, but if you're locking in a 5 or 10 year lease, maybe that's better off, down the road, and you can plan for that a little bit better. You talk about being a young farmer and a long-term strategic outlook. Consistency is a good thing to be able to plan for.
Yeah. But it could also go the other way too, right? If the economy goes really bad for farmland and you lock in a little bit high, it could hurt a little bit. So it could be on both ends, right?
Right. But I would say the land is probably going to be more consistent year over year than fertilizer prices or, other input variables. So at least, from a management perspective on what can we control as a farmer, sure, you might not like looking at 300 or 350 or 400, whatever that cash rent dollar is, but you know what to plan for year over year and how you make those adjustments.
Right. And we've all heard the stories about somebody who's been farming Martha's ground for 25 years. The family's been doing it forever, and that cash rent is low because it hasn't adjusted up as rapidly as one would expect, where there are advantages to the simple cash rent scenario, depending upon that landlord and tenant relationship. But let's take it to the next step. What would you say would be the next step of complication or the next option available for getting access to land?
So just more variables comes into the share rent scenarios. Of course, the most common is maybe a 50-50 share rent. And I was talking about this with a couple of people this morning and what that 50-50 has looked like over time and where it works and where it doesn't work. So when I say 50-50, I would maybe limit that to the Corn Belt or the I states where you have good production, good prices, more consistent hybrid performance year over year, and the genetic gains that we've seen here recently. 50-50 is really a good scenario for a lot of folks. Now, that comes with some caveats, right? You're working in a share rent scenario. You have to manage those expectations very, very closely. So as the tenant, am I the one making all of the agronomic decisions? And if not, what does that need to look like? Because if you're a family member or you're a transitioning partner or you're someone that still wants to be involved or needs to be involved for tax purposes, but you're not letting me make all the decisions, that's an instant way to set yourself up for conflict and probably some issues down the road when it comes to share rent. Now, historically, though, you look at that share rent from a profitability standpoint consistently year over year, it's one of the fairest options. Okay. And whether that's 50-50 or maybe when you get up into the Dakotas, it's a 60-40, 70-30 split, whatever that share rent scenario is, I will say that consistently year over year, when we look at most of the operations we work with, the profitability levels are best and most consistent in share rent scenarios.
That was one of my questions, was this 50-50, because we actually have some farms that are transitioning into a 50-50 partnership lease this next year. And I was just kind of sitting there kind of running the numbers, like, is 50-50 the same? Are both parties bringing the same to the table? Is the land worth what you got in labor and expenses of machinery and all that?
Because that's ultimately the base of this, is the tenant is contributing the labor and the equipment. The landlord is contributing the land, and then the rest of the expenses are meant to be split. And then obviously at the end of that, the same thing with inventories and profit.
Yeah.
You did that out really well. And what I like about what you guys said there, and that hits near and dear to my heart with the consulting side of the business, is that equipment cost. And time again, when we look at the costs that are portrayed by universities or even some private data that's out there, typically what we see is those equipment costs are way undershot for what they are for replacement value, what it's actually costing a farm operation year over year. So you do need to evaluate that closely. It's not the landowner's responsibility on what your equipment costs. At the end of the day, that's a cost that you incur. Those are choices that you make as the landowner or as the tenant, excuse me. But you better know what those numbers are, and you better have it mapped out on real profitability in order to compare apples to apples versus a cash rent scenario or some of the other options we'll talk about here.
That is important. Like, you could be farming with some 1970s tractors and, grow the same crop, and your equipment cost might be way lower. You can probably have a higher repair bill.
And probably higher a number of hours.
But does it matter? Does it matter what you have for an equipment line? Because I have filled out cash rent deals from land that's been managed by a company. I won't say their name because it's probably a multiple, but they actually make you fill out what you have for machinery lineup. Like, they actually want to know, does it matter if it's 2002 John Deere 8400 or, a 2013?
Right.
I don't know why they make you do that.
So I have a couple of reasons why they make you do that. One, part of it is for profile pairing to make sure that you're lining up appropriately with what the landowners are looking for in a tenant. So, maybe some basic profiling as part of that. But more importantly, what they want to look at is the market value balance sheet or the overall, tax depreciable assets that you have in your farming operation can a lot of times be an indicator of what they think you can pay. All right. Okay. So we can keep our opinions of land management companies and, some of the other stuff that goes on there to ourselves. But ultimately what they're looking at is what is your availability to pay, your ability to pay, and how does that match up with the pieces of property or the pricing that you may be able to afford as part of that.
So they might use it as like a pre-screening that, okay, these guys have all newer equipment and they probably farm a lot of acres and can probably pay more.
And part of that comes into, from a business model, understanding where they're coming from is, you look 10, 15 years down the road as a business, who do you want to tie your wagon to? Who do you want to hitch your wagon to? Do you want to hitch your wagon to the farms that are going to be here in 15 years? Or do you want to hitch it to the operation that you maybe have question marks on?
Yeah.
Maybe it's someone that's running 40-year-old equipment, but they're going to retire in 15 years.
Yeah. I just struggle with that as a farmer because, you could run a 20-year. Maybe you're just rolling every 5 years and you still buy those 20-year-old equipment, but just run a lower cost, but still a good farmer.
Right.
So that's tough.
So the share...
Don't disagree at all.
Yeah. So the share leasing option is probably more based upon where you're listening at, is what it sounds like. Is Corn Belt standards 50-50, but ultimately it's a conversation between the tenant and the landowner as to what you feel is fair. Is it, high quality ground? Is, what type of assets are both parties bringing to the table before you decide to split revenues?
Right. And so the other thing that I would say with the share rental agreements, that's also true about any of this when it comes to landowner interactions with the tenants. I mentioned it earlier. What are the expectations? So are the expectations of the landowner that you are going to produce the best possible crop? You're shooting for, 320 corn, 85 bushel soybeans and they want to see you make money and they want to make money too. Okay, so that's one type of expectation. Maybe you have a landowner that wants to continue to be involved in some sort, right? And we see that a lot with those share rent scenarios is they want to come out and still run a tractor. They want to ride in the combine in the fall and know that their ground's being taken care of. You also have people that maybe they want you to keep their barnyards clean. Maybe they want you to push their snow in the winter, help take care of them as they move and transition into retirement. How do you keep those variables in play and ensure that it's not just about the land and the crop being produced, but that you're taking care of, the person behind it, because it's a personal interaction. And as you guys well know, there's a lot of emotions that goes into making some of these decisions.
Yeah.
There's also some tax benefits to being in a share crop, correct? Over a rent.
So yes. And the comment that I had circled here on my yellow legal pad is transition. Okay, so one of the things that we work with consistently with operations all over the United States is how do you effectively transition? And it's one thing to transition within family. It's another thing to transition with a business partner or maybe a senior operator. But there's multiple ways to do it. I will say cash rent is one of the easiest ways because you can be very flexible on what that looks like over time. Chris and I had a discussion on that today. In a share rent scenario, essentially the profit that comes from the tenant, if it's a buyout scenario or a transition planning scenario, the profit to the tenant is what is used to either purchase assets, purchase machinery, pay for ground, pay for equipment over time. Whereas in a cash rent scenario, not to get too far into the weeds, there's a lot of flexibility there of if you have a base cash rent and then maybe there's some gifting involved. Maybe the tenant needs to, has a year of profitability and they want to pay a higher cash rent scenario back to the transitioning partner. There's a ton of flexibility that can be utilized for tremendous taxpayer benefit for those that are looking to transition out.
I didn't expect that.
No.
I would have thought the same way as you, that by being active, it allowed the expenses to be deductible, which helps tax-wise, but it could be that both lease options discussed so far are good tax opportunities for the landowners. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And you can still deduct expenses, as a partial landowner. So most of the time what we see in transitioning operations that are in a cash scenario is they don't stop farming 100%. They maintain some ground. There's some things that they can write off. But long-term, the best option is how do we effectively transition those assets, not necessarily how long do you have to continue to be involved in the operation.
Nice. Well, I picked up a couple things out of that.
Yeah, that was good.
All right, let's get more complicated, more complex. Let's add more variables. What on your legal pad, what's the next step?
Variable rents. Okay. Big term, all encompassing. I kind of broke it down into a few different categories. So, the first one that you have in variables for production in row crops or most agricultural practices is the price. What price are you getting for your commodity products? Now, this, with that being said, is my least favorite because just following price, you're talking 832 cash corn delivery yesterday. Someone sees that and they say, well, we ought to have the best rent that's out there. Maybe as a farmer, I don't have any corn left to sell. I don't, I wish I did, but here we are. And you see that headline, it has a subconscious effect with those landowners of, are we getting everything out of this that we should be? The second one is yield. And I definitely like this one a little bit better. How are we looking at the yield, not only versus the farm productivity over a historical perspective, but maybe for a county average? What are you looking at county average? How is your farm producing? And how do you make investments to change that over time? And the third variable that we can add into that is yield by profit. Okay, and this is my favorite way to map out a variable rent is how are we managing the yield and how is that farm performing? And then what profit are we actually looking at? Okay, so let's say you have a cornfield that averages 230. That's your 10-year APH that you're looking at. A year like this year, maybe you're looking at 260, staring you down the barrel as you have a good crop out there, and you have good prices. Okay, Is the profit there though? And that's the biggest question. We saw a huge increase in input prices. So just because you have 650, futures, D22 prices, 635, whatever it is, doesn't mean you're going to have a tremendous amount of profit. Now, explaining that to a landowner might be a little bit of a tedious task, right? You have to be very careful because landowners are all different. Some of them want to know how it yielded. Some of them want to see yield maps. Some of them just want to check in and see how you're doing. And some of them, everything under the sun, they want to, dig through your underwear drawers, kind of what we joke about when we talk about that. And how transparent do you want to be with them? And not that that's a bad thing, not that you should have anything to hide. I'm a fan of transparency. It's one of our core values in our business. However, we've seen it a couple different times where maybe some land management companies have come in and, taken advantage of that transparency. So when it comes to these variable rent options, not only are there more variables at play, but you have to handle it with a higher level of management than maybe some of the other situations.
Yeah. It feels like we're on defense sometimes as a farmer when the landlord comes and wants to talk, wow, that's pretty good yields out there. Pretty good prices, because you can go on the internet and look up what the crop price is that day.
Right.
But you can't really go on the internet that easily as a landlord and see how much anhydrous or urea or potash is. And it's hard to, you have to constantly tell them, and it feels like you're complaining sometimes. Or I don't know what.
Well, it comes down to trust. I mean, your landlord, the landlord might have worked with you for several years, but if there's an inkling because somebody at coffee talked to him about it, or a family member that is long removed, hearing different news headlines, seeing all these stories, it plants a little bit of a seed of doubt, and now you have to prove what you're doing. So that can be difficult, because I know as a banker, sometimes it's hard for me to get my customers to give me that information, let alone them wanting to just give it to the landlord.
Yeah. So how do we go about getting set up with a flex lease?
Yeah, so I love what you guys said there, and I made a couple scribbles here. The first thing is being proactive, and we are really guilty of either not making the time or not wanting to address issues or time high profitability or the scary stuff that goes into it, right? You got good yields, good prices. Holy cow, they're going to raise my rent. They're going to be expecting the world. We're going to have to pay $400 cash rent. And 90% of the time, that's not true. They're either not thinking about it, they're not paying attention to it, or they want to make sure that you are profitable because you guys have established a good relationship. So if you're proactive on it, you have the conversations, you just say, hey, I know things are looking really good right now. I'm not trying to play the negativity to it. Like you said, we're on the defense all the time. So some people, rather have their landowners think that it's a drought out there and we're not going to have good yields and prices are going to tank. And I didn't market my grain like I needed to. I don't think that's the right answer. I think it's being open and honest and transparent. And the other reason that people aren't proactive, and this is probably the most important thing, is as humans, we do not like conflict, right? And I love conflict. I want to address conflict head on. And conflict doesn't have to be a bad thing. When we think conflict, we think tempers flaring, people yelling, emotional, and that's just simply not accurate. We can see this stuff coming on the horizon. We've seen enough patterns as producers. We know that we have these cycles and commodity prices and yield. How do we be proactive and reach out and say, hey, I know this is what you're talking about right now with these high prices, but I want to manage expectations. I want you to know what's going on. This spring, I sat down with one of my landowners, and the sheer dollars that go into produce this crop this year, she had no idea, and it wasn't from that she's not intelligent or didn't have the knowledge at all. It was that she did not realize the amount of input increases that we had realized. So when we go through this, variable rent scenario that we'll talk about here in a minute, it turned out to be a really, really good option because I was proactive on it. I had addressed the point of conflict of, her being uneasy. She said, well, I don't know, should I be asking for more cash rent? And it was an honest question, and I was anticipating, and I said, well, maybe, but let's talk about it. So I think addressing that conflict is huge. The other thing that we see people do really, really well from the progressive farm operations is have an annual review with your landowners. And that's not a, hey, Jim, I see you at Casey's. Let's, how things going? How's the family? How the kids? Let's schedule a time. Let's sit down for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it takes. Let's talk about how the year went. Here's the yield maps. Here's how things performed. Here's how we did on marketing. Let's give them the information to make their own decisions and to make their own assumptions. Because if you don't tell someone what's actually happening, they start making it up, right? And not by any fault of their own. It's just, like you said, what are you hearing in the coffee shop or what do you hear on the news? So how do we give them the information to make the best decisions and to make sure that we are the ones that are, taking control of that narrative and ensuring that they have the right information?
So we're sitting here nodding along. That's the beauty of a podcast. You can't see us nodding along, but we were. And one of the notes that I jotted down is we've done a couple episodes on negotiation techniques. And I would argue that the last one with Vance Crowe was actually more of a conflict mediation episode to where, it doesn't have to be a hostage situation, but you can have some soft skills in your backpack to reach in and use to make sure a conversation like that goes smoothly and doesn't end up with someone being offended or frustrated. And then the other thing that I've got is a follow-up question here in a little bit. So are we ready for him to dive into the flex lease scenario that he was talking about?
Yep. I'm kind of sitting here as a farmer, like, where do you even start? So let's talk about it.
No, that's great. So one thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to the variable rent option is that you have to take in some basic considerations. So if you're moving from either a share rent scenario or a cash rent into, this flex lease or variable lease, it's like stepping into a whole new world. So what I would say is you can set a baseline that would be very, very similar or very comparable to what your cash rent is or to what you're already expecting as a cost in the share rent scenario. So one example that I have is, let's set a base of $240, $250 an acre base cash rent. That's a check that I'm going to write, 2 checks throughout the year. I'm going to pay half up front for the crop, half at the end of the crop once we've harvested. That's a guarantee to the landowner. Okay. Then what we do is base it off of profit. So I have all of my expenses tracked minus my management, because that's not the landowner's responsibility. If I choose to live a luxurious lifestyle, that wouldn't be at their expense. You take out that management, make sure that you have all your other variables included and say, what do I need as a profit target on every acre? Is it $75? Is it $100? Is it $150? Whatever it is, whatever the crop is, you can be variable on that. Okay, so I'm sitting down with landowner. Shay, as the tenant, I need $100 per acre profit. How do we evaluate the different variables that we have in price and yield? Well, it's really simple. You take that total income that you have off of your projected price and yield or off of your actual price and yield when you get to the end of the year. Let's say on a corn crop, we made $1,300 of gross income. Our expenses were $1,000. Needed to make $250 for the tenant, for the landowner. So they get $250 out of that. And then that extra $50 that we have, does that my profit? Yes or no? And if it doesn't hit that $100 profit that I need, then there's no bonus paid out, right? Shay took home $50. If it does exceed that, let's say we have $1,400, $1,500 gross income on that acre. Then after that $100 of profit that I need, we start to share that 50-50, 60-40, whatever it may be. So it provides a baseline for the landowner. It provides a target profit to the tenant, and then it provides a shared income opportunity for anything above and beyond. Now, just as important as it is to set a base on a per acre basis, it's also important to set a maximum, right? Because and some people get uncomfortable with this. They maybe start to question it, but maybe on that maximum, I say, the max that I'm going to pay out on a per acre basis as rent to the landowner this year is $375 an acre. That still means that you're having an exceptional year and everybody comes out a winner, but the tenant at the end of the day is the one that has the most risk online to produce that crop.
Right.
Like I said, when I sat down with my landowner, she had no idea that we were, $1,056 an acre to put in a corn crop this year. She had no idea. So on 140 acres, that's $140,000 of risk that I'm taking on top of, what needs to be provided to her as rent and, management, CRP contracts, things like that. Now, that's a lot that I just threw at you at once, but I think the keys there are you have a base, you have a maximum, and then what does that profit sharing look like for anything above and beyond what that target profit is for the tenant?
So how do you decide price?
As far as base, you're talking base?
I'm talking about price per bushel. So if you're trying to establish revenue on that farm, and we've got a bin site that holds all of our grain, if it's not delivered to town, if we're not tracking that bushel exactly all the way to market, how do I decide that the average price per acre was $7.50 a bushel?
So we talked about transparency earlier, right? So all of my contracts that I manage and that we see across the board for most operations that are doing a variable rent is they're taking whatever their average contracted price or average delivery price is and using that in the yield times price variable in order to arrive at whatever that gross income is on a per acre basis. So if you're 50% forward sold, you're going to take that for a certain period in time. So sometimes we'll have people say, well, by December 31st, this is the price that we're going to have set, cut me the check for whatever the bonus is on top of that. Again, because it's not only is it a transparency thing, but it comes back to that trust, and you have to trust that the farmer is going to try to do the best marketing as possible because they need to make the money too, right? There's no incentive for them to not do that or to have the landowner believe that they marketed it for any less. Chris and I talked about that this morning is if you sat down over 10 years and took a farmer marketing strategy and compared it to a market analyst or, someone that was actually trading actively and you averaged those 10 years on sale price, you would probably come out pretty close, within a relative margin of making good decisions. So the idea there is that you have that trust in the tenant and the landowner needs to understand and have some transparency and, hey, these are the sales that were actually made to arrive at that price.
So you've thrown so much at us on this part. To me, it sounds like a really good deal, but then it also sounds like a lot of work and figuring out of stuff. What tools do we have in the toolbox to make this easy for us?
Yep. So there's, a lot of things that are posted by universities. So you can look at infinite variable rent resources. Iowa State University has some good ones. University of Illinois has some good ones. We're going to post a link, or I'd mention it now, on our website. We have a variable lease flex rent tool to where you can enter all this information. So you put in your gross expense, your projected income that's based off of price and yield, and then you set those margins. You say, okay, here's the base that we need, here's the max that we're going to pay, and here's the profit that, I as the tenant need per acre. And it will instantly, kick out these variables and say, okay, here's what your profit margin's anticipated to be, here's what the payout to the landowner is going to be, and how do we manage that? Because what happens when you get overwhelmed with these variable rent scenarios is you start making emotional decisions. And emotion's fine, it's a tool in the toolbox, but more importantly, we want numbers. We want to make sound decisions based off of numbers. And if you can plug your numbers, your acres, your projected yield, your projected market price, and sit across from a landowner and have a conversation with them, you can say, here's a best case scenario. We have great yields, great prices. You're going to get a maximum payout. Or, here's how it looks when things get bad. And maybe this is why we need to have a lower base rent so that when things are really bad, I still get a profit. I'm not getting eaten alive by, low commodity prices. And really it works out better for everybody in the end. That's where the variable rent and some of these options that we look at are better for the tenant and the landowner long-term, but to the crowd that we're speaking with today, it's better for the tenant long-term because a lot of times you can negotiate a lower base rent than what you might otherwise be paying on high productivity ground. Instead of paying $305 base cash rent, you might be able to say, hey, base is going to be $240, but you have an earning potential up to $400 per acre, based off of that profit sharing potential that we have in the formula. So we'll link that resource to it. but yeah, like I said, University of Illinois, Iowa State University, Purdue, they all have some useful tools. It's a rabbit hole to jump down, though. I warn anybody listening to this in advance. You can get overwhelmed with the numbers pretty easily. We tried to make it as simple as possible.
The ceiling is one thing I've never thought about before in that. And the reason that's important to me is I got reached out to by email from I think a big landowner this last winter, and they were looking for bids on, I don't know, like 300 acres, quite a ways away from the farm. I'm like, what's going on here? They wanted, finally, I never put a bid in, and then they said, well, we want $380 an acre. I'm like, whew, that's a bunch. Oh, but it's also a flex. And theirs was every penny over $4.50 for December new crop corn, it's another $1 on the rent. So it'd be over $600.
Wow.
How are you going to make money on that?
You're not. Wow.
So, yeah, watch your ceilings.
I tell you who does make money on that, or what we've seen historically, and people can argue with me until they're blue in the face, or, everybody might have an opinion on this, but where we see a lot of people affording these higher cash rents and or the higher end flexible variable leases is premium products, organic, non-GM, vegetable production, and they're able to afford that. Again, they figured this out a long time ago on having that variable upside potential to the people that own that land, because they know they can cash flow it. They know that they can pay for it because of the premium that they're getting out of their products. So from a premium grower standpoint, a lot of times a lower cash rent is a really, really good deal on just a straight cash rent. You don't have to provide any information. Maybe you're not working with a land management company or someone that has a large amount of land base. That straight cash rent might be a really good situation. However, more than likely, you're going to see more and more people move towards the variable rent scenarios in order to benefit everybody. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the higher level of management, the complexities that go into this, it's more, but landowners are going to continue to expect more out of us as farmers. We should expect that and plan for that and be prepared with the information, because if you're not, as a tenant, someone is going to be.
Right.
There's going to be someone else out there that's going to rent that farm.
I think more and more landowners are becoming younger and more removed from the farm as well. And so they probably don't have that feeling as much as their predecessor did of what's going on inputs and all that kind of stuff. So they might just be genuinely curious. What does stuff cost?
Yeah, and I would say land is being viewed more often now as an investment, especially by those next generation of land owners as it passed down. They know the potential for return on that side of things. But we're getting a little bit pressed for time, so I wanted to ask a couple of questions. So in our area, we've been seeing more what I call bushel rent. So it's kind of a mix between a flex lease and a cash rent lease, because they're paying in bushels delivered. So for example, if you reach an agreement with a landlord that they want 65 bushels of corn per acre delivered to a destination point, whether it's an ethanol plant, a feed mill, an elevator, and then the landlord is marketing that crop. So that's where I would say it's probably more of a flex and more risk transferred to the landlord, because the farmer's risk is to produce the bushels. And if for some reason that field didn't produce, you have to come up with the 65 bushels of corn per acre to deliver. Hopefully your crop insurance makes you whole on cost-wise, but your landlord then gets the flexibility of, hey, if you didn't sell and corn went to $8, that's a pretty good cash rent. So it's almost a cash rent. Wouldn't you call that? It's basically a bushel rent, cash rent contract, but it's flexibility on the upside and downside for the landlord.
It's a hybrid.
Yeah, more of a hybrid style.
So the only problem that I have with that, we've seen a few people move to that, is when it comes to land management, agronomic production, transition planning, running a business, the same principle exists. And that's if you have the responsibility to produce that crop, if the responsibility is lying on your shoulders, you also need to have the decision rights on, to effectively manage that. And that should come back to the marketing. That should come back to, what applications you're making. So if you have someone that's that involved, I would say that they're definitely not a fit for the share rent scenario, because they maybe have an unwillingness to let go of those decisions. And also, just some quick math that I did here on 65 bushels at $4 corn, that's $270 an acre. At $7 corn, that's $455 an acre.
Yep.
So I would caution people that, even in highly productive areas, sure, crop insurance will make you whole, but at the end of the day, that crop insurance payment is going to the producer. The producer still has to write the check back to the landowner on those 65 bushels. Makes me a little bit nervous. I can see why people are doing it from a security and delivery standpoint, but I think you have to ask yourself the question: what do you want to be good at, and how much management decisions are you willing to give up?
Right. And then the second one that I wanted to hit here is, how do you feel about bonuses? So say it's a good year, you end up profitable, you've got just a straight cash rent, and it was one of those rare years, you came out ahead. How do you feel about an out of contract bonus?
I don't like it. If you're going to do a bonus and there's an expectation there, you should be in a variable rent, because you pay out a bonus once and then it's expected. And that's a generalization. People can throw stones at me for saying that, but we've seen it time and time again. 2011, 2012, 2013 were good examples of that. High commodity prices, good years, people paid out bonuses that weren't built into a contractual agreement. And all of a sudden, that's when we saw a lot of those cash rent prices come, because in the subsequent years, 2014, 2015, they didn't get a bonus. So they said, well, we need to increase our cash rent in order to make up for that cash flow. And it's just, if you're going to pay out that bonus and you want to reward the landowner or whoever is involved in those management decisions, you should just move into a variable rent. Take the time, do it the right way, make strategic decisions, and make sure that you have your numbers in line, so you can really get burnt.
See, I'm guilty of doing that. But the reason was because they threw me a bone. We had a 5-year contract, and it was increasing every year. And when stuff went south, they said, no, just pay me what you did in the beginning. And so when times got good again, I turned around. And
so ultimately were in a variable rate.
I tried the variable rate deal. I said, we should just do this. They wanted nothing to do with it. They just wanted it nice and easy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Comes down to those landlord expectations.
Yeah, I mean, you have to know what the landowner wants. And the one thing that we haven't hit on here that I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about is just the sustainability of the land and how that looks over time. We've all heard of cash rent being super high. You have a big operation come in, they maybe don't manage it like they should, and you have degradation of the land and soil. On the back end, you might have someone that's in a share rent scenario that they want to make sure that it stays in great condition for the family for generations to come. So how does that build into the scenarios, into the expectations? And you got to do what works best for you. It's very regional. There's a lot of culture that goes into it. And I would say just, don't worry about that conflict. Be proactive in the decisions that you make, and make sure that you're talking, having annual reviews with your landowners, and making the best decisions with the tools you have available.
Awesome. Well, that's good. I know we've got more questions, but we like to try and keep these concise. So if our listeners have questions of you or want to reach out to you, Shay, how can they find you, or what's the best way for them to get a hold of you? Yeah,
2 ways. So the tool that we discussed earlier, that will be on the website that we use for our cost of production tool. It is farmprofitmanager.com, farmprofitmanager.com, all one word. The tool will be linked at the top there. You can just click on the scrolling tab and it'll pull up that variable flex rent, spreadsheet that we built essentially. Play around with that. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. That's the second way. And it's Shay, SHAY, at agviewsolutions.com. So that's agviewsolutions.com. And, if you have any more questions, my phone number, email, all that's listed on the website. Would love to chat with you about it, because every situation's so different. We don't want you to take this into consideration and be like, well, Shay told me I need to do a variable rent lease. Well, let's have a discussion about it.
Right. That's great. No, we can't thank you enough for spending your time with us and sharing some wisdom with our listeners. I know we scratched the surface. Like you said, everything can be so customizable, but thanks again for hanging out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Corey, of having Shay on the podcast. Second time for him to join. We don't have duplicate guests unless they bring a lot of value. So thanks again for him taking time out of his busy day to share with our listeners all the information he had. But did you take enough notes to be able to summarize a little bit about what we talked about here traditionally as we do at the end of our podcast?
I did. One thing I wanted to say, I think that we ran a little short on time with him. We were both scheduled, him and us scheduled pretty tightly. There was one thing we didn't talk about, which was custom farming is another option. So I think it's pretty straightforward of what that is. But if we want to know more on that, and we've done a show on that before, right?
Yeah, that's right. We did. We talked about custom rates and how that can be another way to get people back into the farm. But yeah. I thought Shay did a good job. Maybe we'll tag team the summary a little bit here, but Shay did a really good job of starting with basic lease agreements in the cash rent, just straight cash rent figure. Got a little bit more complex as he moved into the sharecropping or share leasing side of things. And then we got even more complex, which we could have talked about for hours probably, on the different variable rate or flex lease options available.
Yeah. We dove into it hard, the disadvantages and advantages of everything. I think when it comes down to it, we just covered all the leases.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. I think there was a lot of side benefits on managing expectations with your landlord.
Yeah.
Pairing your profile with theirs, what your goals are, what are your landlord's goals. I think a lot of that was really valuable about how you put things together.
Yeah. One question I had in the beginning, I don't think I got it answered. As a young farmer, how do I figure out, how to get more land under my belt? You want to farm more, right? Profitably, not just because you want to say that you can farm more. But we need to dive into that a little bit more in some future shows.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of creative ways. So if you listeners have somebody who's done that really well, send us suggestions or any examples that have worked for you for us to share with the listeners. But ultimately, you have to know what's going to work for you and what's going to be best for your farm. You always have to be thinking out for yourself and try to put together win-win deals. So I challenge you that if you have tough conversations or landlords that you find it difficult to talk to, is come prepared. Do a little bit of research, put together what your goals are, and make those conversations educated around other options if they are interested in potentially boosting their revenue, providing you a little bit of a less risk option.
Yeah. Challenge to check out the flex lease. A lot of people say, I don't want to deal with that. Show them how easy it can be. There's tools out there that Shay provides, University provides, that make it easier and takes a little risk off your plate and can have some potential upside for both of you. It's best for both.
Yep, I agree. Well, there you go, listeners. That's what we've got. If you've got any suggestions, farm4profitllc@gmail.com. But as always, thanks again for hanging out with us. And until next time, have a good one.
Remember, if you aren't farming for profit, you won't be farming for long.